Welcome in, everyone. We'll get started at about 2 after, but if you want to go ahead and start introducing yourselves in the chat, we'd love to know who's joining us today. Ooh, the chat is blowing up already. Welcome, everybody. Come on in. We're going to get started here at about 2:02 Eastern time. So if you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat, we'll get started in just a minute. My goodness, I normally go through and I'm like, oh, it's great to see this person, but the chat, there's just so many of you. I can't even keep up, but hopefully we'll have some great discussion amongst you all in the chat and then with our panelists when we get started. Okay, awesome. I'm sure we'll have people trickling in as we begin here, but I want to get us kicked off because we have such a great discussion today. I want to take as much time as we have. So I want to welcome you all to Supporting Neurodivergent Students on Campus. This is a webinar sponsored by Mantra Health. My name is Haley Fortune. I'm on the events team here at Mantra. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Today's presentation is going to be about 45 minutes of our panelist discussion, followed by about 15 minutes of audience Q&A. So if you have questions that pop up as our panelists are speaking, feel free to use the Zoom Q&A function. Go ahead and throw them in there as they come to you, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Also, I just want to let everyone know that we will be recording today's presentation and sending it out via email to all of our registrants. So if you have to drop early, or if you have a colleague that you know registered but can't make it, no worries, they will receive that email with the recording following the event. And then at the end of our event, we will have a short Zoom survey that pops up. It's just 1 minute to let us know what you thought of the event and what you are looking for as we plan events for the future. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing screen and pass things over to Carla, who is going to be our moderator today, to introduce our panelists and get us started.
Thank you so much, Haley. My name is Carla Chugani. I use she and they pronouns, and I am the Vice President of Clinical Programs with Mantra Health. I like to say that I basically have the best job in the company because I get to oversee the design of all of our products and services, the clinical component of that. And we recently developed some content and coaching programming specifically for students with executive functioning challenges. And this topic of executive functioning and more broadly neurodiversity is really near and dear to my heart because I was diagnosed with ADHD really late in life. So I'm a clinician and a faculty member by background, and then jumped into tech and did all of that before I found out that I have ADHD. So it's really interesting for me to think back to, how some of my own educational experiences would have been quite different if I had had some of the supports that the absolutely phenomenal and brilliant panelists that it is my pleasure to introduce today are going to be discussing with you all. So I'm going to quickly pass the mic around so that everyone can introduce themselves, and then I'm going to start getting us into our discussion. So just going around my screen, Amanda Jean Babcock, please, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Jean Babcock. I use she, her pronouns. And I am an associate director for outreach with the University of Utah. Prior to that, I worked for 5.5 years as an accessibility specialist with WGU. And I am very excited to be here. And I agree, we have some amazing panelists as they get started talking. I learned a lot just planning this, so you're all in for a treat.
Me too. It's going to be a really fun hour. All right, Cindy Poor.
I am Cindy Poor-Paraso, Director of the Health Sciences Schools at Rutgers, Director of Disability Services, she, her pronouns, and also excited, and I agree with Amanda, we learned a lot putting this together.
Fabulous. And Amanda Nigwadula.
Thank you so much. Yes, Amanda Nigwadula, Director of Disability Resource Center here at Florida International University. And again, like our panelists have shared and like Carla mentioned, it's been interesting for us to check our understanding of these definitions as well. And I've been in higher ed 20 years in disability services for most of that time, have also worked in the victim advocacy space and also with veterans, military connected students. So privilege and honor to join in this fun conversation today.
Thank you so much. All right. So getting us started, before we get into the really meaty discussion questions, we wanted to take a little bit of time at the beginning to do some context setting. So the first thing I'm hoping that we can discuss a little bit is, how do we actually define neurodivergent and neurotypical? What does that mean?
So thanks so much, Carla. I'll dig in here to get this conversation going. And this is actually where we started our planning conversation, was what do we take for granted? So in order to best address these terms and sort of the purpose of our gathering here today, I'm going to situate the explanation within a short anecdote that tracks with my relationship, not dissimilar from Carla, with these terms. So over the last 20 plus years, there's been different terms of art that we've used to inform our work and to hopefully address and support students who are neurodiverse and executive function disorders and all of that different identity. However, first recognizing that there's no medical diagnostic criteria for being neurodiverse. So you can't, unfortunately, we're not going to give you the checklist that you can take away so you are certain that you're getting it right. So, but that's also what's exciting about these terms, because we are welcome to challenge, interrogate, and to sort of better check our assumptions about who is neurodiverse and how we are, when our intentionality is meeting the goals of serving our neurodiverse students. So that's kind of exciting, is that we get to actually check in with one another, and most importantly, check in with our students about how they're feeling about these terms. So first, 20 plus years ago, things were a lot simpler, if you will, because we used a bifurcated definition. You're a student, I was going to say disabled student, but we'll talk about that later. You're a student with a disability, or you're not a student with a disability. And we used largely the compliance definition situated in ADA of in-groups and out-groups, and was it compliance-based? And we like to use a lot of information that came from medicalized models of who's who and what's what, whether or not they fit into the ADA definition. So that was sort of a way we approached our work. And then moving forward, as time passed, we were challenged in our work as higher ed and disability support professionals that there was students that had non-visible disabilities, or maybe their medical diagnoses or diagnostic criteria was dynamic and changing over time. Things like pervasive communication disorders and things that maybe affected the socialization impacts and communication models that were pervasive at the time, that were obviously not working for including these students in education. So we ourselves began to be challenged by those assumptions that came from the medical model. So we began to embrace terms of art, such as, and specifically at the time, for students on the spectrum, which at the time we were using, again, medical diagnostic criteria or pseudo medical diagnostic criteria, such as autism spectrum disorder or Asperger's, before we had autism spectrum disorder. And so as we began to evolve in our work in understanding and were informed by the participants, we began to use the term of art neurodiverse. And that, again, is somewhat bifurcated because it assumes that there's a neurotypical learner or a neurotypical brain. We'll come back to that again later. But so in order for us to better identify and serve students who were learning and their brains were functioning differently in the classroom and in the learning process, we began to expand this terminology to include, and it used to be sort of for a time mutually exclusive with autism spectrum disorder. It has evolved, like Carla indicated, to include executive function and include brains, and we'll think a little bit about pandemic, that process and utilize and engage information in different ways than what we'll assume is a neurotypical brain. So that's sort of, and that journey has tracked with my professional journey in terms of trying to better understand, interrogate, and define the resources we want to present and the way in which we want to adjust our work on behalf of students who are neurodiverse. So current day, we currently have broadly, those of us on this panel, embrace the notion of neurodiversity, and this is where I think it gets most interesting, an identity-based definition. So a value added, a point of information that we use to identify ourselves as folks who contribute to learning and working and thinking with sometimes different lenses, views, and ways of going about that. So we've almost gone full dynamic aspect to now we embrace that identity narrative of I am a neurodiverse learner and thinker and communicator, and that's value added. So that in a nutshell, hopefully my professional experience and my personal experience tracks a little bit with how some of you are experiencing how you're engaging these definitions in terms of art. And I will hit pause for anyone else on the panel who would like to contribute.
And it's important to note that if you go to the ICD or the DSM, you're not going to find neurodiverse. Those who identify as neurodiverse are a wide range, and there's not any specific criteria. Some people that I may consider neurodiverse may say, no, I have a disability, but I'm not neurodiverse. And conversely, someone who I might not consider neurodiverse might say, yes, I am. So it's a very broad term that folks may opt in or opt out of.
Yeah, I also want to add to that when you're working with a student or a peer or a colleague who identifies as neurodiverse, or even if they identify as disabled, one of the best ways to understand what that means is just to ask them, you say you're neurodiverse. What does that mean to you? What does that look like for you? And then you can get a sense of not just how you might apply your own understanding of it, but how they're applying that understanding to themselves. So, any disability, whether it's, a physical condition or a cognitive condition, diagnosis, I always say, diagnosis doesn't matter because it shows up in individual people in unique ways. And so I always say, what does that mean to you? When you identify as neurodiverse, tell me what that means for you. Let me understand that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the related question, right, which Amanda N had been alluding to, is that this is a identity-based term now. And so you'll notice even in the title of the panel, right, supporting neurodivergent students, it's not supporting students who are neurodivergent or who are living with neurodivergence or something like that. Why is it that we are choosing today to use this identity first language versus person first language?
That's a great question. I've learned giving webinars and discussions such as these that it's important to clarify that. As professionals, many of us grew up in a time or learned at a time where the medical model of disability was prevalent. And person first language is a part of the medical model. And some disabled individuals still choose to identify as person first based on their personal orientation of disability. So the person first model distances the person from disability. It separates the person from the negative connotations and stigma with which we have all been socialized. An example of the person first medical model is, I'm a woman with a disability. I am separate from the stereotypes and stigma others associate with disability. And we've heard from the disability community that they're moving more towards the social model of disability, which is identity first. And identity first acknowledges that we are disabled by our environments, by inaccessible environments. And the social model or identity first language references the variety that exists in how our bodies and brains works, a myriad of conditions that exist, and the role of inaccessible or oppressive systems, structures, or environments are what makes somebody disabled. An identity first language challenges negative connotations by claiming disability directly. And an example of how to use identity first language might be, I am disabled, queer, and Latinx. I have a disabling condition and I am disabled by societal barriers.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Cindy. And in follow-up, I think that a lot of our attempts to be conscientious, respectful, and professional have sometimes prioritized our privilege over the end user or the person who is seeking or even is forced to seek services or supports because the educational environment wasn't primarily designed with a range of human needs in mind. So it's an interesting cycle that we've stepped into that we're attempting to navigate through. And I always myself personally think about ableism, or the taken for granted of who belongs, who things were designed for, who has status or privilege in different learning environments, influences and has, as Cindy, you mentioned, in our professional learnings, has influenced disabled people and practitioners and professionals, non-disabled persons, professionals. So we began to take for granted that this is the way in which you respectfully communicate. This is the privileged communication where we focus our efforts, the help seeking model and the help providing model. So having an opportunity to, again, reevaluate and liberate some of these taken for granted in our language helps us also check and refine our approach and provide more privilege to disabled people, disabled students, disabled professionals. So it's a wonderful, important thing to talk about person first language versus using the language that we prefer, which is to give the disability status appropriate privilege in our communications. So this is always a rich and engaging thought process and dialogue to have, not only amongst ourselves, of course, but with our students, because they have a lot of experiences that have taken for granted even how they were defined or have defined themselves. So each of these checkpoints is really interesting to continue to have dialogue and inquiry continuously. So something I always want to emphasize is we're all learning, and we should be, and none of these are fixed points on a map or destinations, but checkpoints in which to continue to reevaluate and examine because they were built in systems that privileged certain viewpoints of these identities.
And I'll say, just real quickly, I recently completed and defended my dissertation, and I included a bit about language just for this reason. I find that the best resource for knowing at large how a community would like to be spoken about and to is within those communities themselves. And in the immediate, I follow the lead of the person I'm speaking to. So some people do have preferences. They don't want to be told that they're on the spectrum. They have Asperger's, or they prefer to be a person with or an identity first. So I tend to default to identity first in general, but sometimes I switch back and forth because it makes sense, grammatically or for the tone and the context, but I try not to be prescriptive. And a great resource for this, if you are on LinkedIn, her name is Meryl Evans. She's a member of the deaf culture and community, and she had a post a while back about what she identifies as disability pronouns. So on her page, she identifies as disabled and capital D deaf, and encourages other people to include their disability pronouns to kind of prompt that proactive, this is how I like to be referred to in relation to my disability.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in because I'm seeing some activity in the chat about folks sharing different experiences they've had with what students prefer. And one of the things we're going to touch on a little bit later is the concept of universal design. And my personal experience is that there are universal practices that make much more sense as an answer than saying it's always going to be identity first, or it's always going to be, person first, right? Like if it's always going to be something, let it be a practice that includes enough universality and holds enough space for people to feel comfortable to say, hey, this is really how I prefer to be referred to. This is how I prefer to be addressed. And these are things that, I used when we were preparing for this panel. I made sure I knew, if everyone wanted to be referred to as doctor throughout the panel, because, it's especially for the one that just got it. Sometimes this is really meaningful and important. You don't want to take that away from people. So I do want to get us moving into some more discussion specifically of our neurodiverse students. Why is it that understanding neurodiversity and specifically the needs of neurodiverse students, why is that so important in education?
So I'll go ahead and take this one. For me, the importance of neurodiverse students and understanding them and really kind of educating ourselves about that community is really that it is so much larger and more prevalent than people realize. Nationally, 20 to 25% of Americans have some form of condition that would qualify them under the ADA as disabled and eligible for services. But most disability service offices at universities are only serving, 10, 12 at most percent of their student population. At my institution, we serve about 8% of our general student population with formal accommodations, and over half of those students identify as neurodiverse. And so, as information and diagnosis and this identity is becoming more prevalent, it's really important that we stop treating neurodiversity as though it's an outlier that we're going to encounter, and rather that this is just a default that we have students. We are going to have students that are on this spectrum of cognition. And so the more we can prepare ourselves and our materials and our course design for, all of these neurodiverse students, we're going to do better for everybody. But a lot of the reason that neurodiverse students really struggle is because historically their ways of thinking haven't been considered. And so I also have a late diagnosis for ADHD, and I like to reflect on all the ways my life could have been different if I had been diagnosed earlier than my 40s. And I see now with hindsight all the supports that could have been in place or that I could have asked for that would be very simple things like after I have a meeting with my advisor, can they send me a summary that's bullet pointed? That's not a big ask, but it would have made a world of difference. If I'd been able to record and revisit a lecture or a conversation, that would have made a world of difference because I also have delayed auditory processing, right? Where people thought I wasn't paying attention. They would ask me a question, I would say, "What?" And then I would answer it because it just took me a minute. And so I think it's really important that we recognize that these students are here. We're already supporting them, but we can always support them better and facilitate inclusive environments by doing so. But they also have a lot of internalized ableism. A lot of these students were told not that they were just cognitively processing things in a different way, but that they were inferior or deficient. They had labels thrown on them that indicated less than. So there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of internalized ableism, and we really want to make sure that we are facilitating a positive association with these students and that we're really embracing this idea of supporting neurodiversity because we're facilitating these innate skill sets and abilities that we can tap into as resources on campus, resources in the workplace. I mean, I know, a lot of us neurodivergent people are terrible to watch movies with because we've already figured out every point on the plot and who did it and what the twist is, an hour before everybody else, right? We have these skill sets, but we don't always have a place to demonstrate them. And so that's why I think it's so important.
And before we move on, universal design has been mentioned a couple of times. So I just want to make sure everybody has an understanding of what universal design is. So it's the concept that you can design something for one population, but many populations can take advantage of it. And it came about through architecture. Somebody designed a curb cut for wheelchairs. But if you think of all the populations that can take advantage of that, you have people with strollers, bicycles, skateboards, those kinds of things. And that can happen in the classroom as well. When you provide captioning, not only is that helpful to someone who might be deaf or hard of hearing, but that can be helpful to English language learners. That can be helpful to somebody who's in a really noisy environment. So we'll be getting more into that more in depth, but I wanted to make sure everybody who's listening in had an understanding of what universal design is. And I'm going to put a link for more expansive definition into the chat.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So the next question, I think we're really going to lean in more to universal design. What we wanted to discuss next is what are the things we can do to make the learning environments more accessible for all students? And why is that so important? Right. And I wanted to kick us off here because before I joined Mantra, I was on the faculty in the medical school at the University of Pittsburgh. I had opportunity to teach a lot of different learners from undergrads all the way to postdocs when I was at Pitt. And I was always shocked, especially with my undergrads. It was shocking to me how when I would just give them a reasonable accommodation, they were so grateful and moved that I cared enough to do this, because my understanding was that this is the law and I am required to do this. Right. So it was really surprising to me, how grateful they were that I was, willing to work with them. And so I did some research in this area, interviewing students about their experiences seeking accommodations. And one of the quotes from that study that really stood out to me was the student described it as being at the mercy of your professors. And one of the things that we found in that study is that there's a pattern where faculty are used to providing accommodations, but there is a checklist of accommodations that people are more familiar with, right? So think about extended testing time or providing notes, providing your PowerPoint slides, things like that. That our faculty are very adjusted to as part of the delivery of their course. But what happens when a student has some type of health condition, complex needs, something that's just not what faculty are used to, and it doesn't fit in very well with the way that they are used to delivering that educational experience? That is where I've seen that we really create negative experiences for our students. And the students in my research talked a lot about having to do a lot of disclosure of their private health information and things like that, because they really felt like they had to justify to the faculty that these accommodations, which had already been reviewed and approved by the Office for Disability Services on campus, they still had to keep justifying to people around them that these accommodations were needed. And so I think that this is a real challenge with the current model of providing individual accommodations. So I'm really interested to hear, you know, how you all have been tackling this at your respective institutions.
So, so much to unpack when it comes to this part of the conversation. And I'm gonna leave space for Amanda Jean and perhaps Cindy, because they have also expertise in this area. But with all respectfulness to faculty, right? And Carla already ripped off the Band-Aid a little bit there and saying she was in a faculty position and sort of leaned in and was received with a lot of gratitude and support for doing what sort of needed to be done, right? So following that line of thinking, our faculty and those who, so right, I may be the gatekeeper, determining accommodation, eligibility, and recommending the academic adjustments, right? And it's a tidy checklist. But I find that and that locates, as you all know, the problem, if you will, in the individual student or the learner who is disabled. And faculty feel pretty comfortable and competent with that. However, like the examples already given, when it's less of a fixed diagnosis or something that may be more dynamic related to, I don't know, being human, it becomes more, it appears to the faculty to feel more burdensome, right? So once they're out of the comfort of the prescribed, and we've heard that word already used, response to the compliance aspect of supporting disabled students, it becomes more challenging. So we like to think of, in our work, of universal design and learning as putting some of the responsibility primarily and first in the responsibility of the curriculum decider and determinant, which is the faculty. And so I find a lot of faculty are champions for inclusion unless they have to remove from their course shell a poor quality PDF document, find the source document and re-upload it. And then they're done. They're like, isn't that the responsibility of the accommodation office? However, had we imagined this differently, where all the important priority information that needed to be communicated to all learners was first and always of quality and usability, and not assuming there could be an accommodation add-on or exception that would come through the disability office, and quality was a core component for all users, we wouldn't really need an accommodation office or letter or retrofit. So it's sort of where, again, we've all of us, disabled students, professionals, disabled support services personnel, academics, we've been fed these assumptions taken for granted that located the problem through a compliance-based assumption, which was there's a retrofit, there's an add-on, and you can do it later. Universal design and learning gives us permission and tools to challenge that assumption and say, where do we want to locate the problem? So very many of our learners would not encounter show-stopping educational experiences had we first paused and thought about the design of our learning management system, our course shell, the documents and the redundant learning opportunities we've created in these environments, and who, generally speaking, without an accommodation add-on or letter, may be excluded from full participation at the point of origin. So UDL, and there's an image from my UDL colleagues in CAS that never left me. And it's an image of a corn muffin with blueberries on top, situated next to a blueberry muffin, a delicious muffin with blueberries throughout. And it argues, is the first image of the corn muffin with some cold, rinsed recently blueberries dumped on top as delicious, appealing, and good for all as what we all sort of know to be a blueberry muffin? So that gives us a good, Cass says, bake the blueberries in from the beginning for all the time, no exceptions. Don't wait for someone to tell you they really needed the blueberry muffin and dump it on top. So that particular visual has really helped me communicate create buy-in when thinking about what belongs to who, where the problem is located, and whose responsibility it is. And so, you know, the UDL model really argues it starts first with accessibility and inclusion, and then later, when all else has deemed a shortcoming for a particular learner, we can use an accommodation office and not the reverse. So, and I know Amanda Jean has some to add to this, and Cindy's expertise is in this area as well.
Yeah, no, I love that, the idea there. We use that same comparison a lot when we talk about course development and software development and web design, about cookies in the chocolate chip cookie, right? When do you bake in your cookies? Because you should be including them from the beginning. Accessibility should be a consideration from the very start of a process. What I do find regarding faculty is that sometimes they just want to have a simple conversation with the people making these decisions, because it feels very much like they're being dictated something. And we're all human beings, and especially if we don't like to be told what to do. You know, we've been doing our job 20 years and suddenly someone is saying we have to change our teaching, right? I find that if there's resistance on the part of faculty, or you know, they're making they're telling you reasons why they can't do something, sometimes it just, a little extra investment of my time, I can turn that resistance into allyship, because they just need to understand, right? If you have a faculty member who says, absolutely not, this student cannot record my lectures, you know, they're just pushing back, then you have to reach out and say, tell me why that concerns you. What specifically are you concerned about? And sometimes they just need to know what the benefit of that particular accommodation is, right? Like, in what circumstances might we approve this accommodation? Why does it actually serve the same end as your instruction? Because the DSO, Disability of Office, is not trying to work against faculty. We actually have the same goals. And through accessibility and universal design and open dialogue, part of an interactive process with faculty and staff, we can actually enhance the faculty's purpose when they teach. They just don't see how, because you know, we've been so separate. We have that legal barrier and that medicalized barrier that we need to break down between our offices and the rest of campus.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that this is one that I can we're all very passionate about. I can tell the folks on the call are passionate about too, which I love. And so I actually want to like poke the bear a little bit more, as is one of my favorite things to do. So how do we address the issue of faculty resistance to inclusive design, especially given, so I'm gonna do a little pivot because I want to just acknowledge some of the really good stuff that's in the chat. So resistance to inclusive design for a number of reasons, right? So sometimes we hear from faculty that they don't have the resources, right? Like, when exactly am I going to have time, and who's going to support me and evaluate if I've been successful in completely revamping all my course shells that I've been teaching like this for the last 20 years or so. And then there's also this question that's coming up a little bit that's like, okay, well, yes, universal design, and like nothing is ever truly universal. So what if I put all my eggs in this universal design basket and it still doesn't, you know, and then students are still asking me for all these, you know, one-off accommodations. So how do we address this and overcome this resistance?
That's a great question. When we talk to faculty, especially about universal design and accessibility, we often hear and really feel for faculty because they have limited resources, and they get overwhelmed just thinking about redoing even one section of one course, you know, much less 3 or 4 courses. I just can't manage that. I don't have the time. When I give talks to faculty about this, I introduce them to the concept or remind them of the saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And so it's important, number one, to understand accessibility and universal design, and then make a commitment to make one small change every time you go into your course shell. You don't have to sit down one day or even one weekend or even one week and completely revamp everything. Just know that every small change that is made will have a positive impact on a variety of student populations. And also understanding that those changes, even though they're all overwhelming from the outset, you only have to make those changes one time. You may need to tweak them in the future, just when you're changing your courses and updating documents and so forth. But the overwhelmness will work its way down as you go in and take these incremental bites or steps to update the courses and to use more universal design concepts, or to make documents accessible. And also, I think you're not alone necessarily. Some schools have instructional designers who can really impact course design. Disability offices, if they can't help you, they can at least give you resources to help. So, somebody had mentioned tools to test accessibility. Their Blackboard and Canvas, for example, have embedded tools that will show you how accessible your course is. So it's not, in many cases, or hopefully in most cases, the faculty member is not alone. You can partner with others on campus, or you'll have our email addresses, and can contact us if you need support as well.
And Carla and Cindy, I'm seeing a lot come through the chat about our student life colleagues and those who are maybe not in the built classroom or involved at the curriculum design level. But and part of this is, how do we move toward uplifting inclusion as a core value on campus? So UDL supports this. You kind of hear it from our overarching themes. You have to have disabled students, disabled participants, disabled learners, kind of giving feedback. They have to be in the feedback and leadership roles within your programs. So, and the universal design and learning principles apply to those settings as well. And they sound like things like this. Did you send out the agenda for the important professional development camp or the leadership symposium when we were on the plane, or a few days before, or a week before? So those things about not having pop quizzes, or having the syllabus available early or open for refinement, things like that, they apply in those settings as well. And a lot of the same things that become barriers for all participants who otherwise then need to have this retrofitted accommodation add-on, and that includes leadership development programs, semester abroad situations. If we had participants disabled participants giving post-hoc feedback, involved in the pre-trip, being able to, so build intentional opportunities for ongoing dialogue, critique, and giving privilege to who we believe we're including in our outreach and design of our programs, and always sort of assuming that we haven't been as effective as we believe ourselves to be in designing a program for all, that we've made those good efforts, but that they always need to be refined. And so creating that culture is interesting, fun, and dynamic work, but we have to adapt some of these learnings in a dynamic fashion to other settings. But we have a disabled student union here on campus, and they are my go-to first foremost advisory board. I ask them to provide leadership and competencies to me and my team. I ask them respectfully to participate in as many of these conversations as they can possibly manage, and to really infiltrate where these decisions and determinations are being made. So that, and really universal design and learning is really no more complicated than always saying, who are we, who is our target audience, who are participants, who might we be leaving out? And in a culture of accommodations, it leaves out a lot of folks, and they're primarily segregated in our support offices. And as a function of that legal compliance approach, which has its importance, we've managed to again marginalize these critiques, these inputs, and this particular perspective from all of our happenings. So striving to be, honestly, the word is inclusion, and to be more inclusive at every single touch point will get you bite at a time closer to the goal of a program or an event that's really usable and enjoyable and available for all.
Absolutely. So I'm not surprised at all to say that we're running into our Q&A time. So there's, we had more discussion points, which we're gonna maybe save for a follow-up on this, since everyone seems to really be enjoying the discussion. Before we get into the Q&A though, there is one more question that I do want to pose to our panelists, simply because it is something that comes up so often, and I want to make sure that we are answering tangible questions of concern for the folks in the audience. So the question, which again is the pokiest of the poking the bear questions, how do we respond to concerns that inclusion might be unfair to other learners?
So I'm gonna give my little shtick, and then our panelists will tease it out a little bit, because there's a room for dialogue on this. I have taken what I'll call a pragmatic approach of saying I embrace our institution of higher education framework, which is we really want to be a solution center to be able to distill various inputs from all different perspectives, that we have, the life of the mind, and that we want to honor and preserve the intent of curriculum and experts to facilitate those dialogues, learnings, the process that is so rich, and the academic discourse that we so value. However, I would argue that if that's what we're sharing is our macro campus higher educational goals, that they're somewhat diluted by the fact that our accommodation offices, one for which I work, is supporting on average up to 11%, but at our campus, 6% of our otherwise qualified learners are not in those discussions, in those group settings, in those pre-exam inquiries. They are, by function of receiving accommodations, in many instances segregated out of our best practice for how we imbue education and the light in the life of the mind, being able to have this distillation that we so value. So I've used the pragmatic approach of saying, I completely buy what you're selling, and I am struggling about how to best ensure that our neurotypical students, our non-disabled students, are not losing out on an entire segment of neurodiverse learners, contributions, perspectives, and challenges that, as we all agree, should be imbued in our educational framework. So that's sort of a question that I will raise when allowed to have an honest dialogue about some of these concerns.
So in my previous role, I poked the bear a lot. And I was often challenged on the true value of accessibility and the cost of it and what's the ROI. And I found that one of the most successful questions in response was, how many students are you comfortable excluding? How many students are you comfortable remaining in a harmful environment to their learning? Can you quantify that? Well, that's not what I meant, right? And it's true also, you can have, when people push back on your campuses, you can ask variations of that same question. Well, I don't want to do this accommodation because it's harming the other students. Again, that's an interesting perspective. I'd like to hear more about that. Our intention is never to harm any students by approving accommodations. What are you specifically concerned about? And because sometimes that resistance is based in a lack of knowledge. But if they continue pushing at it, again, how many students in your career are you comfortable actively excluding then?
Mhm.
Can you tell
And
me
when
how
I
many?
hear the all too
Mhm.
frequent question of how is this fair to other students?
Mhm.
I may find the need to raise the question, how fair is it that this student has to struggle with this condition?
Exactly.
Whether they're physical, mental, or whatever. We really need to stop thinking about what's fair,
Mhm.
and start thinking about how to allow access for all students.
Mhm. Yeah, and as we discussed in our prep, why is it that our focus is always going first towards the privileged group,
Yes.
right? Like that would be I don't work in an office for disability service, but like as a faculty member, that would be the question I'd be asking myself. Like, why is it that my urge is to prioritize one group or over another to begin with, right? So with that, I know we have probably way more questions than we can ever answer. Please do, Haley will remind us about this again right at the end. When you get your post-webinar survey, please do give us feedback. And in particular, please share the topics that you would like to learn about. We can see that this is an important discussion and it's one that folks are eager to participate in. And we really do use the feedback that you all in the audience provide to us to decide what we're going to offer for future presentations. So please do just raise those questions and issues and challenges up. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Haley, and she's going to give us a chance to answer a couple of questions from the audience.
Amazing. Yes, we had so many amazing questions come in, and so we will try to get to as many of them as we can. I think one that I'm seeing a lot, and it keeps kind of getting repeated, and I know we touched on a little bit, is where can faculty learn how to make these accessible resources? How can we get cross-campus organizations involved? Lots of questions about student life, about counseling centers, student affairs, things like that. I think if we can touch on that a little bit more. Also, people saying that their resources are very limited. So what external resources can help, and what can they turn to?
So Amanda had mentioned CAST.org, and they are a great resource for universal design. And universal design, as we've mentioned a couple of times, is a really good approach to inclusion that helps multiple populations. Also, North Carolina, I believe Chapel Hill, they also have a Universal Design Center that takes a slightly different approach, but they're both very, very good resources.
Amazing. And we'll also share out some resources via email when we send out the recording as well. So if you didn't catch it as we were talking about it, we'll send that via email. Okay, great. Let's see. Could you potentially provide resources strategies that will help us work with neurodiverse students? I appreciate the structural talk, but for those of us that work one-on-one every day with students, we'd love some actionable tools. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So my first advice to myself always is I sometimes, say professionalism is an ism. And so just check that first. And so first address the person, the student, the learner that's in front of you. And all these great tools and techniques are only as good as they're meeting the person in front of you. And Amanda Jean touched on this as well. Remembering always to give primacy and privilege first and foremost to the person and the learner in front of you, and partner with them. So I have a lot of predetermined bag of tricks that I can pull out and sort of superimpose on any student in front of me. But I work very hard to first sort of, and this will resonate a lot for our licensed mental health folks and our social work folks, is sort of that goal setting with the person, because we're all in different places of our journeys. A couple of us have shared, being diagnosed later in our academic journey. And so recognizing, again, with the ADA model, we like to think a lot of like fixed points. And so really just abandoning that notion, but a lot of typical tools that are not, it's not one size fits all, of course, but a lot of like Amanda touched on, saying, I went ahead and took some notes while we met. Do you want me to go ahead and send them to you? Would you like to meet up again, process out some of this information, and then come back with some questions that you probably need to ruminate on? So being flexible in your engagement or your service approach is a huge win. And just being open to critique. So I often say, like, how do I imbue good allyship? I learn to welcome critique and authenticity. And I also learn to apologize when I haven't been able to meet the person's request or what they were seeking through my office or role, and to address it. So obviously, dealing with the person in front of you in an honest and with integrity, being willing to adapt and adjust, even if everything you've learned seemed perfectly right, and willing to concede some of that. But redundancy and communication is a huge key to success in working with neurodiverse students.
Something that I put in the chat also is that we really have to not make assumptions. We're conditioned to think of things like somebody putting their head on their desk. They're tired, they were out partying. It could simply be that they're overstimulated and they need to just reduce stimuli by maybe not seeing things in their visual field. They may need to concentrate on hearing. And there's a whole cadre of behaviors that are so often misinterpreted, that we really need to maybe even ask the person, tell me about this, help me to understand this behavior or this process so that I can know better how to support you.
Yeah, and I put in some links to a couple resources. One is the Neurodiversity Hub. It has some quick hits on things that you can do. Lisa Yates put in a really great book, The Neurodiversity Edge by Maureen Dunn. Even though it's not related to serving students, the Job Accommodation Network has a page where they identify a lot of different disabilities and potential accommodations or adjustments that, they work in the workplace, but they can also work for students and best practices. And then Neurotribes is another one I put in there. And that is a great resource if you have that in your school library. If you have not read Academic Ableism by Jay Dolmage, I highly recommend that because it gives you a longer perspective on just how deep these roots go in higher education, and it brings in colonialism and some of the other, racism, eugenics, a lot of the things, because we have to remember too that disability is an identity and it is an intersectional identity. How people understand themselves as disabled is also how they it has to do with how they understand themselves as a woman, as a man, as a non-binary person. They understand themselves as a Black woman or a Black man or a Latina or Latino or whatever, whatever other identities they carry. There are complex intersections. And sometimes when a student comes to you, their disability identity might not be the first thing that they're thinking of. I had someone come to me after the election, and it wasn't his skin color or his disabilities he was concerned about. It was his status as a gay man in a conservative state. And so it's so important not to make assumptions and to recognize that there are cultural intersections that happen in what kind of support students are seeking and why, or why they might resist. So I feel like that's, in addition to so many other things, keeping that intersectionality on the brain, even when we're not allowed to talk about it directly, as a DE&I thing. So.
Yeah, Amanda, I was going to say that leads me to a question that we're seeing a lot, which is this idea of the stigma behind all of this and students who may not seek help from accommodations, and how can we get them to the help and the accommodations that they need? Could we talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I can actually chime in on that one because I saw this all the time as a faculty member. And I think it goes such a long way, or at least it did for me as a faculty member. It goes such a long way for a student to hear from their faculty, hey, I want you to be successful. I want you to have everything that you need to get the most that you can possibly get out of your educational experience. I'm delighted to provide these accommodations to you. This is your legal right. It is your right under federal law to receive this. Do you need help finding the office? Do you want me to introduce you? Like, I mean, to the extent that faculty are willing to be champions, sort of flipping the script from faculty resisting this to faculty actually taking up the mantle of, gosh, my goal as an educator is actually to educate people. And so what if I just fully leaned into that perspective that everybody who needs this has got to have it if they want it? Um, I found that to be very helpful. I think we could take one more comment from a panelist and then we'll have to wrap up because we are right at time.
Something that we mentioned in the chat, one of the Amandas typed in that glasses and contacts are widely accepted accommodations. So when students talk about accommodations and the stigma, I always bring up, the fact that, not having perfect eyesight is a disability. And can you imagine a world where people were stigmatized by wearing glasses and we walked around not being able to see anything? And that really helps reframe it, I found, for a lot of students.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think Haley we've run overtime, which is perfect. I really hope we will come out of this doing a series of follow-ups with more concrete tips, tutorials, instructions. That was one thing I saw a lot of in the chat was, can you, sort of model some of these direct engagement strategies, in the ways that you'd be using them with students. I really hope we do that, Haley. Let's make it happen. But for now, we do have to wrap up. So Haley's gonna go over a couple of housekeeping things and then we will conclude the hour.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're over time, but I just want to thank all of our amazing panelists. This was a really, really fabulous discussion. And we had an unprecedented amount of people try to join the webinar that I think there were some people that didn't end up getting in. So no worries if you registered for the webinar or you have a colleague that registered and couldn't attend, no worries. We will be sending the recording out and this will be available on our website on demand. So for folks that didn't even register in advance, it's going to live on there for them to check it out afterwards. And yes, as Carla mentioned earlier, we have a survey that will pop up as you leave the Zoom to ask for your feedback on this, as well as suggest possible topics that you want us to cover in events as we move forward. We do have an event coming up in February that's going to talk about crisis and suicide prevention. So keep your eyes out for that. We'll have that panel registration up soon. But I just want to thank you all one more time and thank everyone for attending today. It was a wonderful discussion. And have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you all soon, hopefully.
Bye-bye.